Welcome, everyone, to Odds and Ends Life, Entertainment, Theater, and the Arts. I am Andrew Joseph Kozlowski, and with me is my good friend, our world-class musician and music producer, my co-host, Mr. Cool himself, Mr. Clyde Ballard. Clyde, how you doing, baby?
Good. I'm doing wonderful, man. Just grooving. Still trying to be a great musician. You know, music never ends. You keep reaching to get greater heights of comprehension. But today is really special because we have Aurora Flores. She's a Latin historian. Thing. She's a historian. Yeah. She had her own journalist company.
Yeah.
And she has interviewed almost every major Latin artist.
What an amazing list of accomplishments.
Oh, please.
Now, she is a musician and a composer also.
Yes.
A writer, a journalist,
yes.
a producer, yes. an agent. And she's the daughter of Latin music and culture. She's an activist.
That's
and
right.
As a journalist, I guess she's been a trailblazer, working being the first of a Latino person to represent yes. her field, you know, in various different organizations. She was a correspondent for Billboard magazine.
That's right.
The first Latino woman, right?
That's right.
And then she was the first female editor of Latin New York.
That's right.
Then there was the Christian Science Monitor, I think, right?
Yes, but she also is the person who's been writing all the liner notes for the Fania Records re-releases. Fania Records is like the most major record label that ever existed in America. Many major Latin artists were on Fania, and wow. She is very close to Fania Records.
I tell you, yeah.
In her own way, I'm saying, in her own way, she was like the Barbara Walters of the Latin community.
Yeah, we're in for a wonderful treat. So before we bring her on, ladies and gentlemen, here's a little something to introduce you to Aurora Flores.
Mi bandera. Shout out to Gary in the house. Happy birthday, baby.
Clyde, unbelievable. I'm looking forward to it. Ladies and gentlemen, Aurora Flores. There she
Hello.
is. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hey.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to start out by saying, I want you to know, we know that we are not Latin historians. We're not experts at all. That's why we brought you on. You hold the power here because you have so much more knowledge than we could ever have. So, that's it. Now, I want to know, I wanted to say also, I first became aware of you. I was in Woodstock. I was playing a show with Nego Gato. And after the show, I went back to my hotel room, and on PBS, there was a special about the Palladium, a very instrumental club in New York City that featured Latin artists, and Sammy Davis Jr. used to go there, Marlon Brando, etc. And the way you were speaking about the Palladium with such passion and alacrity, I said, man, I want to meet this lady. I want to work with her. And maybe 2 weeks later, I bumped into you at a ceremony somewhere in Spanish Harlem, and we met. And since then, we've been kind of connected. So I guess so people can understand who you are. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started and what were you doing in the Latin music community and music world?
Well, it's a loaded question. Let's get started. And let me start at the beginning, but also round up, because a lot of people meet me now and they see me. I started writing about music. Then they see me for the past maybe 15, 20 years doing music. And they say, oh, you have all these different careers. You did PR, now you do. And it's only been one career, really. It's only been one career. And I like books. I've always loved books. I've always loved reading. I've always loved writing. And I've always loved music. And I think especially during this time of the pandemic, I really went with books and music for solace, because it was such a hard time, especially at the beginning. Yeah. I lost 10 friends. I was afraid to pick up the phone. I mean, it was like that. Not to mention all the gigs lost and everything else. But it was a really, really sad time. And so, yes, I've always gone to books and I've always gone to music for solace. And I was raised in the projects. My parents came from Puerto Rico and they didn't speak English. And my first language was Spanish. And I went into a public school system where there was no bilingual education. I developed a very bad stutter. And during that time, it was reading and books, and then music that would help me communicate. It was a form of education. It was a form of information, but it was also a form of communication as well. And so as a young girl, I first started being in the projects. I organized the tenants one day after we didn't have elevator service for a week. And I lived on the 19th floor, and none of the elderly people could get to their apartments. And I called the newspapers, and they all came. And I was about 14, 15. I was the spokesperson.
Right.
For everybody in the building. And I was like, wow.
Amazing.
And during that time, what was good about public school at that time was that there was music in the schools.
Now, what school did you go to? What public school was this?
I was in, my elementary school was PS 179, and we had a glee club there. Not only did we have a glee club, we would do theater. There were kids who would play piano. We had auditorium. So in the auditorium, and even those kids who maybe didn't have a musical talent, you had to memorize monologues. I remember
in English.
Yeah, monologues. And I remember, for my 6th grade graduation, I had to memorize President Kennedy's speech.
Wow.
When he said, ask not what your country can do for you.
Yes.
Ask what you. I never forgot that because
I
had to memorize that. And plus, I came from a neighborhood where I remember being about 8 or 9 years old. Herman Badillo at the time.
Sure, I remember him.
He brought Kennedy, both of them, to the hood, to the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I remember meeting him with my mom, and he shook my hand. I never forgot it.
Wow.
So I remember when we heard the announcement over on the school that he had been assassinated. I mean, I just put my head down and cried.
Yeah,
And
everyone
from
did.
there, I went to junior high school, Joan of Arc,
Okay.
which sounds like a Catholic school, but it is not.
It's
It was a
not.
public school on 94th Street. And I remember Lindsay was the mayor back then, and we had an orchestra. There we had an orchestra. And from there, I picked up, I started on violin, and then I picked up the bass. There was a small German baby bass there, and nobody wanted to play it.
Right.
And I got interested in it. And I remember I was the smallest one. I had to sit on a stool and lean it towards me. And I had to start with garden gloves at first because it was catgut. And with a bow.
Cut the fingers off.
Oh my, and my fingers, baby fingers, you know, they were bleeding. So I used garden gloves until I could get Alice.
You can see my bass behind me. See it?
I see it.
Yeah.
I see it.
Now another thing we got to mention
was a little bit darker wood.
Sure.
Lighter wood.
Yeah. Now another thing I wanted to say, we also should remember that President Johnson in 1968, he was the one that initiated the Hispanic Heritage Month, which supposedly
68. In 68, was it?
1968. Yeah. Supposedly it begins September 15th to October 15th. And that's what we've been celebrating all of these years.
You sure it was 68?
Yes. Yes. Google it. Check it out.
I'll check it out.
Yeah.
Heritage. Because I know that in 1975, we inaugurated the first week in September as the official Salsa Day in New York. So before we even get to that, going back to junior high school, I was in the orchestra. I studied privately. Then I became the charity case of Frederick Zimmerman, the bassist. And I would go to his apartment at West End Avenue. I remember he would only charge me, well, at that time, it was a lot of money for my parents.
Right.
$5.
Wow.
$5. And I would, and he knew I was canceling because I didn't go. You anyway, even if you don't have the money, don't worry about it. And so I would come to him, and then I went to music and art.
Oh, that's a great school.
Well, I was there only a few months, and then I joined like this jazz band, and there was a guitar player. And he didn't even go to music and art. He was just a guitar player from, this little, you are your kids, form little ensembles. And he started calling my house. And my father picked it up, and he was like, no, I'm the oldest daughter of four. And he said, no daughter of mine is going to be a musician. They're all putas or drug addicts.
Wow.
He took me out, forbid me to do music, said I should be a teacher or a lawyer. So I went to, regular public school, but I was still involved in the music because I would listen to Symphony Sid. Now I was involved in jazz, so I'm listening to Symphony Sid. To Symphony Sid, one day I hear conga because I knew the Latin music. I grew up with it, but that Tito Puente, Celia, Cortijo, that was my parents' music.
Right.
And they sang about the farm. The chicken and the hen and the cow. I was raised in the projects. I saw that in books, and or the one time I went to Puerto Rico, but that was not my reality.
I think also that maybe Tito Puente probably got catapulted into a major fame because Carlos Santana and the group Santana recorded his song Oye Como Va.
But that came later, honey.
Yeah, I know.
When I was growing up, he was the king.
But I'm saying to the major world didn't know him then. The major world didn't know him. I think after that.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that then.
Yes.
But this was my parents' music, and this was huge, and
yes.
Then to Symphony Sid, one day I'm listening, I hear the conga, but I hear this dude singing in English, and he's singing about the projects, and he's singing about the number 6 train, and he's singing about Subway Joe and riots and being a poor boy, and I'm like, oh my God, what is this?
Yes.
So now I'm getting into Latin music. I'm getting into boogaloo. I'm buying the records, but I gotta hide them because I can't let my father see me doing this. And but then I'm also involved in school in writing. And in 5th grade, the teacher took us to see Shakespeare in the Park. I see Hamlet for the first time.
Wow.
It was like, oh my God. And then my brother remembers the only place I could go when I was young was to the library, to the rehearsals in school and to the library. So in the library, they knew me so well. I used to use my mother's little cart because they would allow me to take out like 10, 15 books a month.
Right.
So I'm a reader, and I'm like, all of this is going on. And, in the meantime, my mother's telling me about Puerto Rican history of my background, that she's also seeing me writing. I'm keeping a diary, and she's telling me that I have this in my blood. And she's telling me about this guy named Hostos, and if they're teaching me about him in school. And I'm like, no, Ma, I never heard of this guy. They teach me Lincoln and George Washington. I never heard of Hostos. And then I'm a teenager, and then in the projects I see these newspaper about my culture, but in English, it's Palante. And they're talking about the history of Puerto Rico. And I would tell my mom, and she would tell me, that's not right. That didn't happen that way. But, and she was actually right. But it was an awareness that started awakening in me even more. So now
you formed your own company in a way, your own communications company.
Well, this is all processing. And I'm a young girl from elementary school to teenager. Now I'm in high school. I go to college. And of course, what I want to be is a writer, because I figure this is, my mother would see me writing. And I guess for my family and everything, that was the thing a girl could be.
Okay. At that time.
You either a secretary, a teacher, or, but it had to do with writing. And that's what I wanted to do. So what do? I'm in college. I'm working part-time at a publishing firm, Harcourt, Brace, Jovanovich. I go out to lunch one day. I didn't read El Diario. Again, that was my parents. I didn't read Spanish. Now I'm fully English and everything's in English. I listen to jazz and I'm listening to boogaloo, and I'm reading The Village Voice, and I see this magazine, Latin New York magazine, and I open it, and it's about this music, and it's all in English. And I'm like, wow, I want to be a part of this. So I called them, and I volunteered. And I went there, and it was the craziest interview of my life. I'm from, Harcourt Brace. I'm from the button-down literary world. What was it, 1973, 74? Women wore those blouses with the big bow ties. And yeah, I have my resume. I have my writing samples. I had gone to Lehman College. In Lehman College, I wrote for the Meridian. I was also political there because I was part of Frente Unido Latino, and I started a women's caucus, and we took over the president's office so we could get Black and Puerto Rican studies.
Wow.
And I almost got arrested. So all this stuff is going on. I mean, it's the 60s, 70s.
And Fania Records is growing and growing.
Fania Records is growing, but they were not the only ones. We were getting 45s, and I remember there was
Pico Records.
Inca did not exist.
Okay.
There was Fonseca.
Ah.
Okay, there was Fonseca Records. See, you never even heard of them.
No.
Fonseca Records. There was Seco Records, but Seco was more the older guys like Celia, like Tito. There was Alegre Records. I remember they had Richie Ray and Bobby Cruz. Mm-hmm. And I remember I loved Mr. Trumpet Man because when I was in junior high school, the few months I was in music and art, we did a few hooky parties. So in the hooky parties, they played things like Richie Ray and Bobby Cruz. And I remember I loved Mr. Trumpet Man. He likes the way she plays the trumpet. I mean, it was a great song. And this was great music in English. And it had a funky backbeat. And it was a reflection of who we were. Because
wouldn't that be kind of classified as boogaloo?
That's what I'm telling you with Boogaloo.
Yeah, Willie Bobo, Pucho and the Latin Soul Brothers,
But
Bang Bang.
the DJs like Symphony Sid, they were playing like the soul music, okay? So they play a Motown tune, and then they play one of these tunes, or they play later on Ray Barretto or an Eddie Palmieri tune. And so all this stuff is going on. I see Latin New York. I volunteer. I tell you, my first interview, I go there. There's a bunch of guys talking about musicians, and it was like I didn't exist. And they're all talking about the conquest that they had in the balcony of the St. George Hotel at the gig that weekend.
Sure.
Okay, the feminine conquest and all the stuff they were doing. And I'm like, I'm sitting there horrified. They're talking about this like if they were sharing ice cream.
Right.
So I'm listening to this and I'm like, do they know I'm even here? Then I go see the editor. And I was used to, the corporate world, they have the fluorescent lights. This guy had a little lamp on, so it's dark. I always wore glasses. I go in, I need to adjust. And I'm sitting there and I sit across from him. I see this newspaper on the desk, but it looked like he had stuff on top of it, but you couldn't really see. So I'm talking to him and I'm telling him that I could write and that I could help them because obviously they needed help. They needed a lot of like stylistic, grammatical, a lot of help like that. But the content was great. It was kick-ass. It was cutting edge. It was irreverent. It was like a Village Voice. But for us, it didn't have that old-fashioned politeness of my parents or what they would teach me was going on in Puerto Rico. So it had that. So finally, I tell him how I wrote for college. I give him, he says, do you have any sample work? I said, well, I have a draft here I wrote on machismo. I give it to him. Then my eyes finally adjust and I realize on that piece of newspaper, he's got a mountain of marijuana.
Oh, boy. And
he's sitting in front of me rolling a joint. And at that point, he goes, well, we'll call you if we're interested. And I'm like, oh, let me get out of here. And I went back to work and a few months later, I didn't hear from them. A few months later, I picked up the magazine and my article was in it. The one I gave him, the draft on machismo, with a whole illustration. He did have my name on it. They have my name on it. And I was like amazed. And I called them. I started working for them voluntarily. Then Pablo Yoruba Guzman from the Young Lords was the editor.
Guzman,
Yeah, he was the editor then, and then he had Americo Berrios, who used to do the Palante newspaper, putting out Land New York, and the whole thing. Then Fania was getting even stronger. That's when you started seeing more Fania, more out there, because he was starting to get more control then. Because after 1973, Fania belonged 100% to Jerry Masucci. So then he was getting more in. And the thing just boomed, and I just happened to be there, and it just like took me with it. It was, it was, I think as a journalist, and I think I've heard many other journalists say this, I think what we love about it is that we're constantly learning.
Right.
No matter what they assign you.
Right.
You have to throw yourself into the research, and you really, really have to.
And who was your first major Latin artist that you interviewed?
Tito Puente.
Wow.
Tito Puente. And then, so my parents, I threw them a curveball. Okay, I'm not a musician.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't want me to be
Aurora.
You didn't want me on the stage. So I'm a reporter. Yeah. I'm writing about it, though.
Aurora.
The way was better.
Aurora, let me ask you something. Something comes to mind right away while listening to this. You talked about as a child you had maybe a little stuttering issue?
A big stuttering issue until.
All right.
Don't know that now.
And then... But you always had that leadership stuff going on inside of you. So, Clyde and I are involved in an organization that takes young people and uses the arts to bring that stuff forward. And it appears to me that you use the arts to get out of that that to gain your confidence and to find what that talent was inside and then push it forward. And you always kept the love of it. So that was the first thing I had to ask you about. But the second thing was, what about how difficult it was for a woman at that point to try to do what you were doing? I mean, it was a man's world. And here you are conquering, literally. You're literally stepping in and you're starting to move forward in a world where it had to be very difficult, no?
Oh my God. I mean, I don't know if you read I kept diaries. I called them my Salsa diaries.
Mm-hmm.
And lately I've been going back to them because I'm writing my book. And
Right.
I don't know if you saw the article I did write, my first chapter, which is on Medium. And it's called An Audience with the King. Meeting Tito Puente for the first time before there was a Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Okay.
And I have to tell you though, Tito Puente saved me. I have to tell you, he was very protective. But what I went to and what I saw, and I have to tell you in a way, my father was a tough guy. Growing up, my father was the breadwinner, and to him, he was the king. My father was also, before there were celebrity chefs, my father was a celebrity chef. He was a chef of Titsho. He used to tell us when Ed Sullivan would come into the restaurant because he was on a special diet. He was the only one who would have the skin removed from his chicken and his vegetables steamed and his rice. You know, people didn't eat like that in the 60s.
Right.
And, you know, he bought my mother a silk scarf from Ever Gardner one day. If it was from Ever Gardner, I don't know. But he also lived, after a while, a certain lifestyle like them, you know, and I will say it. I think had I not had, growing up, a father who was an alcoholic and he was an abuser of women. And I grew up in a home of domestic violence. But I protected my mom and I was my mother's translator. So even with the stuttering, see, my mother knew that the stuttering came from the conflict of the two languages. When I got into school, I spoke Spanish. Everybody else was speaking English. So there was a clash. At school, they thought there was something wrong with my hearing. And I remember my mother telling them there's nothing wrong with her hearing. It's the language. And I remember when they give you the reader, you know, the reader, Fun with Dick and Jane and all that.
Yes.
And they made me go in front of the class back then.
Yes.
And I was in one of the higher classes, like one class, the SP classes, and everybody starts laughing at me. And you know, you're a kid. I remember my cheeks were so hot. My tears are coming down. I look up at the teacher to like, hey, you know,
help me out.
She's laughing harder than all of them. And I remember getting so angry. My tears stopped. I was so angry. I said, I'm going to learn English better than all of you. And I did it.
See, there was something inside of you, though, even that 14-year-old that led your tenants around, your neighbors around to try to take charge.
Get on an elevator, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing thing. You were born with the gift. So it's just
That's
quite
what
amazing.
my mother would tell me. My mother would tell me that too, that since I was a kid, that people would tell her that there was something about me, that I would take care of her. And I kind of did. She passed away 4 years ago. I took care of her. She died here in the home with me. I had visiting nurses, and I'm so glad I did that.
Yeah.
I hear all these horror stories now about these places. I'm so glad I did that. And I remember at one point she turned around and she told me I was the firstborn, that I taught her how to be a mother because I was the firstborn. And at one point she told me, you saved me. I know if you were not there, you would have killed me. And so my father was a tough guy. He had women all the time. They would call the house. I'd have to translate and tell these women, American women, my father is married with 4 children. And I got to tell you, I think seeing that and getting the blows I did to protect my mother, he toughened me up because here I fall into this Latin music world. I'm 19, 20 years old, and I'm dealing with guys that are 40 and 50 years old, that are drug addicted, that are into, most of them are pedophiles. I'm going to say it. If they got a 14 or 15-year-old, they didn't care. And I looked like a baby.
Sure.
But, you know, I bit and I scratched.
Now, another thing I wanted to talk about, Aurora, is I think the love affair that America has had with Latin actors. Let's talk about Fantasy Allen, Ricardo Montalban, or I Love Lucy with Ricky Ricardo. And
from way back, Rudolph Valentino.
Right, we can go way back, but I'm just saying, let's talk about
from the beginning of film. Rudolph.
Let's talk about Ricky Ricardo, because America loved him.
America loved Ricky Ricardo. But
why do you think that was so, though, Aurora? I mean, coming from your perspective, what about it was
exotic? It's just different.
Is exotic. That what it was? Was there something about that culture that America fell in love with that really had something over everybody else?
Well, you have to remember this. Let's look at the history of that time. In the 40s, there was that radio blackout. So there was a whole music strike. And you could put this recorded music on the radio. And that gave rise to Latin music. BMI was just starting. BMI had Peer International. They had so they're giving the radio all this Latin music for free. They don't have to pay for it. Then at that time, you also had, who was big? You had Perez Prado. And he got really big. But in the 40s, that's when you had a young Tito Puente with Abanico.
Xavier Cugat, maybe.
Xavier Cugat, yes.
Yeah.
So all this, and then it became popular. It became popular to play Latin rhythms. So you had clubs like the Latin Quarter at that time.
And the Palladium, yeah.
Right? And the Palladium.
Sure.
But clubs like the Latin Quarter had house bands that played Latin music and played Latin rhythms. Some of them called it continental. And they do things like some of the Italian stuff, like Volare. And so they called it continental or green eyes or quizás. But all of that became real big. And then you had at the time, the president started a South of the Border program. So a South of the Border, like neighborly program after the war. So that's when Carmen Miranda and all that got big. So this is all happening at the same time.
Well, also, wasn't Tito Puente in the Navy?
Younger, he was
United States Navy, yeah.
Yes, he was in the Navy. He was in the Navy prior to that.
Right.
So all this is happening in the 40s, the 50s hits big with mambo, with Perez Prado, who's in California. And he's like, and by the way, the Cubans in Cuba hated mambo. They thought it was.
Really?
Oh, yeah, they hated mambo. They looked at mambo like the jazz guys today look at hip hop. That's how they look at mambo. So it was like, wow.
But then look at Aurora. When we talk about Cachao, Israel Lopez, he talks about mambo favorably.
Okay. Yes, now.
Now, okay.
They all talk about mambo favorably.
Now, okay.
But back then, that was not the case. And they even gave Cachao, the brothers, credit because they did some of the first arrangement. They had some of those chords for the mambo. But the one that popularized mambo and put it on the map was Perez Prado. He really did. I mean, when he did, I remember when I went to Music and Art, one of the songs we had to learn was Cherry Pink and Apple Blossom White.
Yeah.
And Perez Prado was playing that stuff.
Quincy Jones talks about him a lot as well. Yeah.
So in a way, I did the safe thing, what my parents wanted me to do. But I threw them a curveball.
Yeah, you certainly did.
And then I threw them a curveball because now I am. But in a way, I got to say it was good because I have to tell you the level of drugs at the time, and you had to have some level of especially cocaine. Cocaine was the touchstone of the cool. There were some places that if you didn't have cocaine, you didn't get in. I got so tight with what I would do would be I would interview like the band leader. I would get tight with them. Many times, well, I learned how to smoke pot because I had to do something, right? So
Right.
at least if you can smoke weed, you're cool. But many times they come and they give me this little tin and they put it in my hand. And I'm like, no, you don't need to. Oh, no, it's okay. And I know it was a test to like, and I'm like, okay, all right. I take it with me, you know. And then I'd have these girlfriends who tell me, you're the only jerk we know who trades cocaine for pot. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm the only one that's sober at the end of the night to drive all you women home. I mean, it was just an incredible time.
Sure. Yeah, well, drugs were very prevalent. Drugs were very prevalent in rock and roll as well as jazz too. It was just something that people felt was the way to go, you know?
It was a time of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Exactly.
Our community was sex, drugs, and salsa. But it was just, everybody was affected by that.
Right.
I mean, it was a whole entire generation. The only difference was my generation, we didn't reject our parents' music out and out. We rebooted it. And we brought in the elements of jazz and brought in the elements of funk because these were the people around us in the projects. You know, it was us, you know, the Puerto Ricans and the blacks. And we were the ones in the project. We mixed the music. The DJs would mix the music. I mean, we were together in the projects, in the schools, in the factories, in the jails. You know, it was us. So we were sharing this music and it was growing. We were growing as a community. We were growing united as a community. We were protesting. And this music that was our parents' music that now we infuse to reflect New York life, because now it was faster. You listen to the old music, it's slow because they're in warm countries. You don't go fast in warm countries. So yeah, son montuno, you know, it's a la que me lo pida se lo doy, you know. So it's that kind of smooth, laid back kind of feeling. You listen to salsa here. This is in your face, hard edged.
It's different. It's a different
it has
community.
An attitude.
Yeah, different attitude.
And now we're not talking about chickens, and we're not talking about the country, and we're not talking about the cows. We're talking about what were we talking about back then? Well, the boogaloo was all about the fun.
Right.
And the boogaloo gave rise to all of this. Although I will say that Joe Cuba did take it political. Joe Cuba, when he took that line from Dizzy Gillespie, and he was like, I'll never go back to Georgia.
Yeah, I remember that, sure.
I know blacks who told me that in the South, they were marching to this, that they looked at that like, you know, and he used to tell a funny story, how the governor, who was very racist at the time, called him about his song.
Really?
Joe Cuba, yeah.
Wow.
And that he got all nervous and he said, oh, no, I'm not talking about your state. That was my ex-girlfriend.
That's cool.
So, but I have to tell you that I kept a certain decorum of the decadence.
Okay.
Decadent.
You know, and let's not...
I used what was there, what I could.
Sure.
To get entry and to make them feel confident so they could talk to me. And it got to the point that some of them, I mean, I had this friendship with Imai Rivera that I thought was amazing, because one day I realized he's telling me all these things, and he started crying and telling me how when he was at the Palladium, it was a challenge among the musicians. It's like the jazz musicians. How much dope can you use and still get on that stage and give a kick-ass performance?
Another great thing that's not known, Aurora, is Larry Harlow. Larry Harlow, I believe, is of Jewish descent, but he's one of the greatest known, Latino, pianists.
He's a Latino pianist, and basically he's a very well-known Tony producer. He was like one of the in-house producers of Fania, especially at the beginning. And him, Louis Ramirez.
Sure.
Louis Ramirez was the musical director of Tito Rodriguez.
I love him, yeah.
Yeah.
And what about the owner of LP, Latin Percussion Instruments? He's not from Puerto Rico.
Martin Cohn, but he came later.
Right. Okay.
He came later. Yeah. No, he's
Yes.
Jewish. There were a few Jews in the industry, especially in terms of record owners. The
Yes.
biggest one, Morris Levy. Morris
Wow.
Levy, Tico. And Morris Levy, after a while, bought Alegre. So then
Oh yeah, Allegri. Yeah.
yeah,
Sure.
so then he inherited La Lupe, he inherited Tito Puente, Celia, Ima Rivera. He inherited all those guys. So
Wow.
so
And
when,
let's talk
that's
briefly
why-
too. I don't want to leave out. I think an important part, maybe in a certain weird way, is Irish or Arish Chacon, because she was probably one of the first Latino women that had a huge impact. I don't know if it was for the right reasons. I think she was on channel 31 back then.
yeah, it was a UHF channel. You had
Yeah.
to grab it ears to get it.
Exactly.
But I remember Walter Mercado used to come on first. And if
Yes.
you haven't seen that Netflix movie of Walter Mercado, you need to see that because that was part of our growing up. And he would come on first 15 minutes. And I remember when I went to visit my mother, you could not talk when he was on. But as soon as he finished, you'd hear the song for Iris Chacon, Iris Chacon, Iris Chacon. And they're building it up. And I have to tell you, every man in New York City watched that show.
Andrew, you know about her, Andrew?
Mm-hmm.
Very beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
Of
woman,
course he knew
black woman.
about
Of course.
People
Oh.
watch the show just to watch her.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Yes, they did. So, I mean, you had to have a certain decorum among all that decadence to survive. And my superpower or my protection was my pen.
No.
And then I wrote, and I think what they liked was that right away, I would sit down with them and I would ask them intelligent questions. Like if I sat with Luis Ramirez, I would ask him about his arranging. When I sat with Tito Puente, I loved one of his songs where he actually took Chinese scales and put it into mambo. I thought this
Yes.
was amazing. And I wanted to know how he did that or how he recorded the album where the two big bands are together. And then he tells me how the bass player, Ruben Rodriguez, was the heart of that album because he actually played with both bands, Buddy
Wow.
Morrow and Tito Puente.
Right.
Oh, what a great recording that is. So when you sit down with them, I mean, I see people today doing interviews and I'm amazed. If you don't waste an artist's time, first of all, I think when you're going to do that, you respect the artist.
Right.
You're not there to hang out with them all day. You have a
Right.
certain amount of time that they're giving you.
Yes.
So you do your research.
Yes.
I mean, if you're interviewing him, it's for a reason, right? And someone like Tito Puente, when I got that assignment, I took it serious. I went to the 42nd Street Library. I took out microfilm. I went through every single thing I could. And I wasn't going to go in there and ask him, when were you born? And
Right.
we just don't do that. You know,
Sure.
someone like this, you go to the heart of what you want to know in the interview.
How was it being in Tito Puente's presence? How did you feel?
Well, at first I was very nervous. And then when I walked in, it was in Ralph Mercado's office. And they wanted me to get there at 9:00 at night, which I thought was strange. But I
Wow.
figured, well, it's the music industry.
Yeah.
But you got to read my article. And that will tell you
Okay.
how I was
Yeah.
nervous.
Okay.
I was nervous. I didn't expect them to be sitting there with bottles of Courvoisier and all this snow on the table. I mean, I was still in college. I had never even seen that live.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
in
yeah.
college in those days, it was like smoke and Boone's Farm wine. You know,
Sure.
it was stuff like that. But you know, cocaine was like Hollywood stuff. You know,
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
I wasn't used to that. So,
Right.
And so when I walked in there, I mean, right away, I tensed up. You know, I was like, so the first thing I did, you know, just out of nervousness, I sat down, took out my tape recorder, had my notes, and I just started asking him questions. So he's looking at me curious.
Like, why are you rushing? Why don't you relax?
No. He was
Oh.
looking at me because he was impressed with the questions I was asking him.
Ah. Okay.
And he even asked me at one point, don't you want to know, like, where I was born? I said, I know all that already.
I already know that.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
he
yeah,
saw
yeah.
all the copies of the paper. And I think he was like, wow, this kid, because they would call me the college kid. the college kid.
Mm-hmm.
He said, this kid is, and when I walked in there, look, my mother was scared to death. She told me, you're going to be working around who, when, what? And she taught me, and I was a feminist. I was into, man, I was already in college. We had, taken the president's office. And she told me, if there's a bunch of hungry dogs in the corner, you don't walk in front of them eating an hamburger.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at that time, you got to remember, 1972, Planned Parenthood is everywhere. Abortions are legal. Women's lib. We were burning our bras. And I don't care what woman tells you, oh, no, Puerto Ricans, we were. All of that affected us, too. It was like they opened the cage where they had us all locked, and we were out there. And we wore the miniskirts. You see the films, and we have the halter. We're not wearing bras. And I wore one today, by the way, okay? I did. I know we're all used to that. I hope you guys got pants on. Because I don't know whether they're doing these things without pants. Anyway, but back then, this is what was going on, And
yeah, for sure. Aurora, it's amazing.
You think women were like that? I mean, yeah, that was happening. So I have to tell you, every time these guys they tell me now, oh, we all used to think you were Pentecostal. One guy told me, oh, we all thought you were a virgin because, you would just come in and you were serious and you would leave and we never even got to see your body. So I'm like, yeah, that's right, because I was covered up and I always wear pants. And after a while, when I would talk to them, I would notice, especially the older guys, when I would talk to them about music and really get them in the middle of music, they would start talking to me as if I was another guy.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd even call me dude or bro. I love that because I knew
you were changing the story.
Yeah, and I was suspending their reality.
Yeah.
They weren't looking at me, And I never went in with nothing low cut. Everything was like, I don't know what they thought of me. I didn't care. My thing was I had to go in and get a story, and I was going to get my story. And
get out.
Aurora, you do a lot of lectures at colleges and universities, and I it would be mind-boggling for me to see you talk to the kids of today who are looking at how they approach business. I'm going to say business, whether it means how they dress, how they act, what they do to get ahead in life today. And then they hear your story and they hear this amazing, tough-minded woman who went in there and won the respect of men that at a time when the culture just normally wouldn't allow it. What are they like when you tell them these stories today? I mean, do they accept these stories or they can't believe you?
I think they accept it. I just had two young women do a podcast about with this 2-hour podcast we have on Spotify about my life, and they're amazed, and it's amazing that, especially in the music industry, I see a guy like Weinstein. You know how many Weinsteins I came up with, especially in the music industry?
Yeah.
There were a lot of those guys, man. And I felt bad because these women, they were hungry. They wanted to be models. And I could see the way, oh, well, we'll take this off and take that off and take the other thing off. And I have to tell you, I'm going back now and reading my diaries and reading all about 20 and 21-year-old Aurora. I'm amazed. I'm like, oh my God, I said that. I did that to that guy. I'm like, I'm surprised I wasn't beaten, killed, raped.
Right.
That book someday is going to be one of the best sellers. Really a story of how you navigated through an industry that was set in its ways.
Yep.
And became successful to the point where they actually respected you one-on-one, talking about music, talking about the culture, you became the essential interviewer. I mean, you were the one that everybody needed to be interviewed by in that industry.
Well, Billboard was the Bible.
Yeah.
Right.
And there have been women, because when I look at Billboard from that time, I see, I think maybe one woman's byline was an article. But from what I was told from the secretary, and I remember she told me I was the first music correspondent. In other words, I was out there.
Right.
I was going to clubs. Some of those clubs said unescorted women not allowed.
Yeah.
I remember one time I was at Cabo Jojeño. I got to tell you, there were a bunch of greasy older guys there. I didn't want to dance with those guys. You know, there were these greasy older guys with the greasy hair. And I was like a hippie, you know. I'm like, no. And I didn't even want to dance with them. So I was with a cousin of mine. No, I was with, a cousin of mine. So we start, there was a really, I think they played Típica 73 or something. I love the tune. And we're dancing. The owner of the place came, separated us, told us that we had to dance with men. Can you imagine that? And I said, no, we're leaving. We're going. Goodbye.
It's amazing. Listen, how about you telling us some of the gentlemen, some of the ones that were your favorites throughout all the years? Because obviously there's so much to be told about the culture that you had to deal with to get where you are. But now you've approached this certain status. You've talked to just about everybody. Who are some of the real fine people in this business who maybe weren't like that and maybe really were good people that you interviewed? Some of your favorites.
Tito was one of my favorites. And I know the musicians have all these other stories, but I have to tell you, with me, he was a gentleman and he protected me. And even his wife tells me that he used to talk about me and would be proud of me, and that he wanted his daughter to be a reporter. She's a weather person, but you know, I'm like so.
I do see her on. I see her on TV now. You're right.
Yeah. Because I mean, not for nothing, I know Tito was a hound dog, but he was cool with me. He was such a cool dude with me. The other guy who had another bad reputation, and I remember my father, when he found out he was a friend of mine, forbid me from even bringing him to my home. And that was Ismael Rivera. Okay. And he was the one I told you that it came to a point where they were confiding in me. He was telling me about the Palladium. That's where he really got addicted to heroin. And he was telling me that it was a trap, that it was a macho trap. And he starts crying. And I realized at that point that the reason he felt he couldn't, he was like a man's man for these macho guys, you know? So he couldn't talk like that to them. And then all these women, he was like, forget it. He was
the embodiment of machismo, right?
Yeah, and of all these women, he was like, not Tom Jones. Tom Jones is a wuss. I'm talking about somebody who's rugged, who's like, that everybody kind of wants. Like, anyway, he was a sexy guy. He was also like 45, 46. I'm 21. And you know, when you're young like that, someone who's 30 is old. And I look at him now and I'm like, oh my God. To me, somebody 40 was like, oh my God. He's like, and I was not interested in him like that. And he knew that.
Now, what about Johnny Pacheco? I loved him. Johnny Pacheco. That's the guy.
Pacheco was more, I talked to him and he actually thanked me 1 or 2 times. But Johnny was very, very full of himself.
I love to watch him dance and conduct the orchestras.
Oh, honey, he was lit like a Christmas tree.
But, I mean, I bet that Latin women found him extremely attractive, right?
Oh, all of them. Are you kidding? Not only Latin women. In those Madison Square Garden concerts, I'd see Andy Warhol. I'd see people like Eric Clapton. I'd see people like all these rockers were there.
Right.
I mean, they were handsome men. And when you perform, it's physical. So here they start, and then they improvise, which is also different from the Eurocentric artists. So they're improvising within a structure. They're gyrating and they're sweating and they're
the congas are playing and their African rhythms are, right.
All right. So how about we break? How about we see if we can get a headline before the book comes out? Was there one guy that you really, really had a crush on?
That I had a crush on?
That you really had to fight not to get involved. You had the crush.
Wow.
She had Clyde. She's smiling like she's going through a number of them. Wait a minute. What is it?
Yes.
Well, I'm thinking of all the ones that I met. I do remember this. Ruben Blades used to keep his guitar in my office when I worked at Fania.
Mm-hmm.
He would come by and run lyrics that he had written. And then all the other girls were like, oh, he likes you. Oh, and he was so cute. He was so adorable. But Aurora isn't, and I'm asking him, hey, but who's Paula said? And he tells me one day, Paula says this older woman, and she helped him out getting his visa, but he's not. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's an interesting story. Something was off about it. That weekend was a Fania All-Star concert. He was there. I have all access. I go to all the dressing rooms. I walk in his dressing room. He's with this beautiful woman. She looks like my age. She looks like a model. And I have this big smile. And she looks at me and smiles and gets up. And I say, hi, I'm Aurora Flores. I'm doing the press. And she goes, I'm Paula Campbell. Yo, Paula said. She goes, yes. And I look at Ruben. And I'm like, thank you, Ruben. Goodbye.
Wow.
And that was, so that was my little crush.
Now, I want to ask you a question also. What was the Latin community's feeling when Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim, they created West Side Story on Broadway, Rita Moreno?
Well, I'll tell you from my family's point of view, and my mother, like I told you, was very political, and she always instilled in me the love of Puerto Rico, of an independent island, of an island that could govern itself, an island that was in partnership with Cuba and Santo Domingo, and together they could be the great Antilles. So knowing all of this, she talked about Puerto Rico all the time, and at that time, it was a political time, So what was specifically what you wanted to know?
Well, just what the Latin community felt about West Side Story.
Well, I have to tell you,
the portrayal of Latins in the show, there was this rivalry with the gangs, etc. Although it produced a lot of beautiful music, but how did the Latin community feel about the portrayal?
Again, my mom hated when they did that song, I Like to Live in America. Mm-hmm. And I remember I got the album, and when I started playing that song, she said, you are not playing that song in my apartment.
Why?
Because it says, you ugly island of tropic diseases, always a hurricane blowing, always the population growing, and the money owing, and the babies crying, and the bullets fly. Oh, my mother went wild.
Right.
She went wild. Said, you're not playing that in the house. That is, she considered it. She liked the movie. She liked Rita Moreno. She right away saw that
the lyrics were derogatory in her mind. And
the lyrics were derogatory.
And it can be interpreted that way now, looking at it.
And she didn't like Natalie Wood as Maria. She said that really wasn't, She never liked West Side Story. She said it put us down. And that not all of us are in gangs. And that it pitted one race against the other. And I still, I love her that she could see through that. And she kind of gave me the eyes to see through that too. And she didn't like West Side Story. But there were a lot of people that liked it. The music was catchy. It was great.
It's one of the most loved Broadway shows of all time.
It is. Sure. And I will agree to all of that. But she would not let me play that music in the house.
Yeah. It's got to be very difficult because I'm assuming when you analyze what West Side Story was really all about, it was supposed to be a documentary of sorts on what was happening here at this time in our area, in a time when people were confused about what they were and how to mix together. Yes. And I think older people, I remember my mother, how long it took her to get used to an air conditioning and a microwave. I mean, just because they had a preconceived notion about what was right and what was wrong. If you said anything wrong about Italy, forget about. It didn't matter if it was true or not.
Yeah, you just said something bad. Yeah.
You just said something bad, and that wasn't allowed because the love was such that it was unconditional.
Right.
And there was no time for any kind of meshing of thoughts or anything. Well, Aurora, we're going to have to bring you back because we've got so much that we want to talk to you about yet. And I know one of the things I certainly want to touch on later on is I really would like to hear how some of the younger people relate when you give your lectures. Because, again, I guess this is you're really with it when it comes to understanding history and culture. And a lot of our people today have kind of gone in the opposite direction of what our moms have done.
Yeah.
And we're living in a world that's so divided that we need people like you and my buddy there, Clyde, and myself have the same thought process. We preach an awful lot about people have to sit down and talk and understand a little bit better about what's going on. But we're certainly going to bring you back. I hope you will come back. We have probably could do 2 or 3 more episodes covering what we'd like to do with this. We hope you've enjoyed visiting with us in this episode.
I have enjoyed visiting with you. And the next time I would like to talk about when I saw Tito Puente and Santana perform together at Roseland.
Whoa.
Oh, we got to bring that up.
I want to talk about Celia Cruz. Celia Cruz.
There's a whole story before and after that, too.
Oh, boy.
I have a lot of stories about Celia.
Okay. When is the book coming? That's what I want to know.
I'm hoping to finish it by December because we've been in this pandemic. So I'm giving myself to December to finish it and have it up by next year.
What are you calling your book?
Again, it's on my website, www.aurora.
Okay.
-communications.com. And on the last page that says Cultura con Sabrosura, you will see some of my interviews with Barreto. There's an interview there with Pacheco. There is the article, My Audience with the King with Tito Puente. There's a picture of me with Tito Puente there. I look like I'm 14. I'm amazed. I'm like, I look like I'm 14. Oh, God. And I have to tell you, sometimes I'm amazed that I was like a sheep in a cave of lions, and I tamed them.
It is an amazing story. I can't imagine a publisher that they're going to be fighting over this because, I certainly hope so, too. That's for sure. Well, again, we thank you so much for this episode, and I can't wait to book you for the next 2 or 3. That's for sure. All right. Folks, we've enjoyed visiting with Aurora Flores tonight.
Much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was Miss Aurora Flores. What an amazing, amazing guest, and what an amazing story, Clyde. We're going to bring her back, and we've got so much more that we want to talk to her about.
We must. We didn't talk about Celia Cruz, Fania All-Stars at Yankee Stadium.
Yeah, there's
Santana.
a lot. And we'll get her back, and we'll probably have 2 more episodes with her, I'm sure. Yes. She's an amazing person with an amazing history.
And she's brave because she's telling it like it was, like it is.
Well, she's an absolute, she trailblazed the whole thing. I mean, when you think about what she went through to do accomplish what she's accomplished, it's absolutely amazing. So we're looking forward to bringing her back. Folks, stay advised of all the events by following the Josephine Foundation on our Facebook page and Instagram account. Big time thanks one more time to our special guest, the amazing Aurora Flores. On behalf of my co-host, Mr. Clyde Ballard, our producer, Mr. Gio Vitozzi, and myself, peace, strength, and love until we see you next week on Odds and Ends, Life, Entertainment, Theater, and the Arts. Good night, everybody.
And stay bright.
Amen.